the frontier began to be romanticized more than ever. Wilderness began to be romanticized more than ever. And that often happens due to loss, because loss leads to nostalgia. The way that essentially transcendentalism and the Romantic movement started as a result of deforestation in New England and in England, and people developing more of an appreciation for something because they were losing it. Well, there's losses of a different sort going on at this time because of the market revolution and the industrial revolution. People felt like they were losing their autonomy, losing their independence, that they were becoming like cogs in a machine, like strands on a web, interconnected to everything. So something someone does in some business totally unconnected to you can have a big impact on you, and it makes you feel vulnerable. And that led to more yearning for the freedom of the wilderness and a sadness about the impending loss of the wilderness. Even though it's still there, it was in the process of disappearing. And this leads to some historical figures and fictional figures becoming very prominent in American culture. And we're going to talk about three of them, at least three. We're going to talk about Mike Fink, King of the River, that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about, the importance of the steam engine, because those river pirates being such a pesky problem, and Davie Crockett, pictured on the right there, and the Leatherstocking Tales, which, if you're not familiar with that, you will be when I get to it. So, first, let's take a look at Mike Fink, King of the River, who was romanticized and exaggerated in a lot of ways as an emblem of the frontier and of rugged individualism and of conquering fears and taking your own destiny in your hands. A lot of times these frontiersmen would be associated with having the attributes of American Indians, and a lot of times the attributes of animals from the forest. So these images here are from a Walt Disney movie from the 1950s called Davie Crockett and the River Pirates. And the River Pirates in question were led by Mike Fink. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play you just a brief excerpt of a song from that movie, because I think that it demonstrates much of what I'm talking about very well. So hold on.
Listen to the thunder, hear the winds roar. Hurricanes are coming, board up the door. Load up the cannon, call out the law. Worstest calamity that folks ever saw. Girls run and hide, brave men shiver. I'm Mike Fink, King of the River. Oh, he's a ringtail roar and a tough-old alligator. Oh, he's a bone-nosed bully and a real big populator. Oh, what a fighting devil. He'll spit right in your eye. He's gonna live forever. Born to mean to
Oh, he's a ringtail roarer and a tough old alligator. Oh, he's a bull-nosed bully and a real depopulator. So that's the Disney version from the 1950s. Part of the reason I shared that with you is because I first heard it in 1976, 20 years after it was made, when I was 8, and it's been stuck in my head for 44 years, and I don't feel like I should suffer alone, so now maybe it'll be stuck in yours. But now I want to share with you a couple of verses from another song that is much, much older than that. It's an old folk song from the 19th century.
Well, my daddy was a bear in the Allegheny Mountains, and my mama was a gator in the Ohio. I was born full-grown at the forks of the river, and I cut my teeth on a catfish bone. 'Cause my name's Mike Fink, and I'm a keelboat polar, I'm a salt river roarer, and I eat live coals. I'm a half alligator, and I ride tornadoes, and I can out-feather, out-shoot, out-jump, out-hop, out-stick, throw down and lick any man on the river. Well, I pulled the Ohio, and I pulled the Mississippi, and I pulled the Missouri when she choked with snags. And I pulled on the wilds and the salts of Kentucky, and I never met a man that I couldn't out-brag. 'Cause my name is Mike Fink, and I'm a keelboat polar, I'm a salt river roarer, and I eat live coals. I'm a half alligator, and I ride tornadoes, and I can out-feather, out-shoot, out-jump, out-hop, out-skip, throw down and lick any man on the river.
This may seem similar to you if you're familiar with the tall tales about Pecos Bill in the American West, which is in the late 19th century, the riding tornadoes and stuff like that. So these presentations of this actual historical figure, unlike Pecos Bill, that has attached to him these tales that make him seem superhuman and also extra human in the sense that he's not just out in the wilderness, he's part of the wilderness, he's part of nature because he's part animal. His father's a bear and his mother's a gator, and that becomes kind of a common theme among some of the tall tales associated with some of these frontiersmen, these frontier figures. Now, in the 1950s Disney movie, he meets Davie Crockett, where he has met more than his match. So let's take a look now at David Crockett of Tennessee, who in real life was a scout and a hunter and eventually a politician, who had an ability to spin a yarn and to be very, very engaging and charming, have a lot of presence. He wrote his autobiography, in which he repeated some of these tales, he originated some of these tales, and it really caught on with the public. He was elected to Congress, to the House of Representatives from the 9th Tennessee District, and even in his own lifetime, he was being portrayed on stage in his own lifetime. He had become a larger-than-life semi-fictional character. There was a play about him called Lion of the West, 1831. Now remember, Tennessee was considered the West at that time. Then his autobiography came out in 34. Now 1836, spoiler alert in case you didn't know this, he has a really bad day at the Alamo, which only serves to kind of increase his fame to the extent that 120 years later, he was a character in Disney movies, played by Fess Parker. There on the lower right. In more recent years, although I guess it's not recent now, about 15 years ago or so, he was played by Billy Bob Thornton in a movie called The Alamo. So the same kind of idea that he was this frontier figure who went from Tennessee eventually to Texas, who was larger than life. Now, at around the same time that Davie Crockett was, in essence, making himself famous, Daniel Boone, who lived until 1820, when he was about 85 years old, died in the St. Louis area. Daniel Boone had kind of a resurgence in popularity. Now, Daniel Boone was a historical figure who was active in the 1750s and 60s and 70s, and who was well known in his own time and had books written about him that were kind of historical accounts. But by the time that he was in his 80s, already in the late 18 teens, which was kind of the beginning of this whole market revolution thing we've been talking about, he was being transformed into a larger-than-life figure. In fact, he said in his late years, quote, "Many heroic actions and chivalrous adventures are related of me which exist only in the regions of fancy. With me, the world has taken great liberties, and yet I've been but a common man." So he was not quite the self-promoter that Davie Crockett was. And the way that he was presented after his death in the 1830s was he was virtually superhuman. He was sort of like a demigod of the forests, and he was sort of like a human expression of manifest destiny long after his death. Well, same thing with Davie Crockett. Long after his death, his story was living on, and as I said, it was pretty active before his death. In fact, there was a publication, a periodical, published in Nashville, starting in 1835 when Davie Crockett was still alive, called the Davie Crockett Almanac. Now, it did have typical almanac stuff in it, like, when you're supposed to plant and stuff, but mostly it was outrageous adventure stories about Davie Crockett or people that were his contemporaries who were frontier people. So Davie Crockett's Almanac of Wild Sports in the West. It was called at one point, and here in the middle, we are told it contains adventures, exploits, sprees, and scrapes in the West, and life and manners in the backwoods. It was popular immediately and became even more popular after his death at the Alamo. And it wound up being published in cities around the country. It was extremely popular, especially with adolescent boys and young men. So here is just an excerpt from an article by Carol Smith Rosenberg about the Davie Crockett Almanacs, about the fact that he and his cohort of riverboat men, trappers, and backwoods squatters fought with their fathers, broke apprenticeships, rebelled against education, and escaped into a mythical wilderness of forests and rivers. They drank heavily, killed and ate the animals of the forest, fought viciously with one another, masturbated, and whored. Now, some of these stories in the 1830s and 1840s, you would be surprised at how risque, and even beyond risque, they were. I mean, there was a tendency in these stories for Davie Crockett to meet wild women out in the woods and get into various ticklish situations with them. Often these wild women were half animal, like half panther or half wildcat or something like that. So this article that I alluded to is from a few years ago. The article is called "Disorderly Conduct, Visions of Gender in Victorian America." And Carol Smith Rosenberg makes several assertions in that article that I think are just really enlightening. Okay, so essentially he is saying that, in a way, America was in its adolescence at this time in the 1830s and 1840s. It was a transitional period, okay? And there was rapid social change, such as we have been discussing. Now, part of the concern that a lot of the public had back in the 1830s and 40s about these Davie Crockett magazines and their salacious contents revolved around self-control and how these stories of wild and ribald forest adventure was going to rot the brains of these boys and young men who needed to be controlling themselves like good Victorian Americans. Now, because of the market revolution, more people, more young men, were leaving the farm and going to work in the city, working in factories or working in shops or working in offices. And what that meant was a change, really, in how marriage was working among young people in America, because at a time when 95% of Americans lived on a farm before the market revolution, typically what would happen is that when a boy is 17, 18, 19 years old, he gets married. He gets married to a girl that's 15 or 16 or maybe 17 years old, and gets usually like a portion of the land from his parents, and goes off and sets up house over there, and begins a new family working from dusk till dawn. However, it doesn't work that way when these young men leave the farm and go to work in the city, because they're not going to have land to live on for free, so as to raise their means of sustenance, their subsistence. No, they have a job, and they have to pay rent, and they can't afford to get married. So they have to put off getting married until they've saved up enough money that they can afford to live in the city. And a lot of times, instead of that happening when you're 16 or 17, you're in your 30, early 30s. Of course, you still marry someone, a young lady that's probably 15, 16, or 17, because it's the 19th century. But these men are having to put off getting married, but at the same time, they're supposed to behave themselves and be respectable. They're not supposed to be consorting with prostitutes and so forth. And really, they're not even supposed to be consorting with themselves. Masturbation was a big concern at that time from middle-class white America, worried about their young sons not being able to control themselves by having to wait so long to get married. And then, to make it worse, they're reading these wild stories, these inappropriate tales full of sexual innuendo. That's just going to make it harder on them. So these Davie Crockett stories and things like that are a bane upon civilization and respectability from the perspective of middle-class people in the East. And in a way, this is kind of like typical teenage rebellion, because in a way, the cities of the East are like the more mature part of America and represent the father. But these young men, they're itching to go west. Why are they itching to go west? Because they've got all this responsibility thrust upon them. They feel like cogs in a machine, and they want to be free. They want to be independent. They want to be able to do whatever they want to do, to throw loose the constraints of respectability. And you can imagine how well that went over with their parents. So, in a way, the more settled and established East was being regarded as the home of respectability, and the frontier was the opposite. It was the bane of respectability. Well, if you want to go out there, why don't you just go out there? In part because you got to have a stake, and it's not so easy once you get out there, right? There are Native American conflicts. There's making a living out there and so forth. So the next best thing that most young men were doing was fantasizing about the Western frontier, to the extent that it was in itself kind of a form of rebellion. Now, I mentioned a lot of people were concerned about what was then referred to as self-abuse, masturbation, that it was going drive young men insane, make them blind, and all that other stuff, because they are not maintaining the proper sense of respectability. Now, there was a guy named Sylvester Graham who was kind of a health nut, I guess, quote unquote, what he would be called in the 20th century. He was firmly of the opinion that your diet dictates your behavior, and that if you eat wild animals, you're going to be wild. If you eat spicy food, you're going to be a little too spicy. Now, the wild animal things, you will recall, Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur was writing that same stuff 60 years before this, 60, 70 years before this. So that same idea. The blander your diet, the more domesticated and bland your diet, the calmer you're going to be, the more self-control you will have, the more respectability you can maintain. Therefore, Sylvester Graham invented a new kind of cracker made out of whole wheat. Whole wheat, a little bit boring. And that was the point. Eat this cracker and it's going to calm down your blood and you'll keep your hands off of yourself for a while. Now, they didn't have cinnamon on it when Sylvester Graham made graham crackers. That came later, and he's probably spinning in his grave right now knowing that that was done. Well, now let's talk a little bit about the completely fictional series called the Leatherstocking Tales, which was a cycle or a series of novels written in the 19th century by James Fenimore Cooper. Now, these weren't the only novels that he wrote. He also wrote novels about espionage during the American Revolution and novels about adventure on the high seas, none of which are famous. But these books are the ones that are very famous, in fact, and that made James Fenimore Cooper the first American author of fiction to gain an international reputation, to be a literary star. So this was the first successful American fiction, really. And you've probably heard of at least one of these books, The Last of the Mohicans. I'm hoping you've heard of that. However, that was only one of 5. So what I have here is I've got the books listed on the top in the order that the books are set chronologically, and then at the bottom the order the books actually came out. So the first book to come out was The Pioneers in 1823, but that's actually the 4th book chronologically. Then the others were, there was one sequel to it and 3 prequels to it, essentially. And these novels were all about one character, the protagonist, Nathaniel Bumpo, or Natty Bumpo, a frontiersman in upstate New York in the 18th and early 19th century. He had been raised by Indians, educated by missionaries. He went by several different names in addition to his real name. Leatherstocking was one. Now, if you'll recall, back in the 1700s, men wore those long white stockings. His stockings were leather. Pathfinder, the Deer Slayer, and most famously, Hawkeye. And like those fictionalized versions of real-life people, Davie Crockett and Daniel Boone, Hawkeye, or Leatherstocking, has had a long life in American culture. In fact, there have been many different movie versions of Hawkeye, particularly of The Last of the Mohicans, down through the years. And here are just a few examples of them. There's Randolph Scott, 1936. 1992, this is probably the most well-known version of Hawkeye and The Last of the Mohicans, starring Daniel Day-Lewis back in the early 90s. Now, oddly enough, they've kept remaking Last of the Mohicans, and they've made the Deer Slayer once in 1977, but no one has ever made all 5 stories, like in a series of movies or like a mini-series or something. I think that would be a cool thing to do, and I wish someone would do it. Now, the character himself, when he is first introduced in 1923, in a story that's set in 1793, he's getting old. He's getting old, and he is sad and discouraged by the way that the wilderness, the frontier, the forests of New York have been abused in his lifetime, and how they are disappearing, and how much New York is changing. And that came out in 1823. Now remember, this whole process of starting to romanticize people in the backwoods, especially along the frontier, really started in a big way in the late 18 teens, early 1820s. So this was right on the cusp of that. And bear in mind, it was a huge success, the biggest success any American novel had ever had, any series of novels, followed up immediately by The Last of the Mohicans, which was even more successful. That was set decades earlier. In these 2 stories, New York is the frontier. Then the other stories kind of hop around in the life of Hawkeye from his youth to finally in The Prairie, which was the 3rd novel made. He's an 80-year-old man leading a small group of settlers into the Louisiana Territory in 1804. And that's kind of a reminder that he was very loosely based on Daniel Boone, because that's what Daniel Boone did in his old age. Well, I think that this is very noteworthy. Not just that there is such a cycle of books, but that the first successful American novels, essentially, were Westerns. Now, the West in question was New York in the beginning, and then later Missouri, but nonetheless the Western frontier. So from the beginning of American fiction, that has been a topic that has resonated not only with the American public, but, like this series did, internationally. So, as someone who writes Westerns and fiction about the frontier, I find that a very satisfying thing to know that that sort of thing was at the beginning, and it continues. It's kind of like, I think, it's kind of like America's version of the British stories of Robin Hood and King Arthur. It's going to be part of the American cycle. Well, Cooper himself described Hawkeye as a melodious synopsis of man and nature in the West. And there is so much emphasis on nature in these books and on the need to preserve it. It's very much a product of the Romantic movement. It also, kind of in line with what I was just saying, I'm not the first person to say that, British author D.H. Lawrence, well over 100 years ago, called this the myth of the West. It's one of the foundational cycles of novels in what is American literature. And it really not just deals with the disappearing wilderness and with the aging of the backwoods frontiersman, but also with the, quote, vanishing American, that is, the American Indian. Several Native Americans are prominent characters in these stories, the adopted family of Hawkeye, and there is kind of this romanticized sense of the doomed noble savage that is destined to be swept aside by, although the term didn't exist at this time, manifest destiny. So a lot of emphasis on the nobility of Native American culture, but at the same time, in the stories, this guy Hawkeye keeps pointing out to people, I'm actually white, and how white he is. as though that's very important, because that was very important, obviously, to the author and would have been important to the readers. Now, another interesting thing about this is that there's a romance in Last of the Mohicans between an American Indian man and an English woman, a young woman. It is a doomed romance, and they both die, and that's kind of what tends to happen in these romanticized stories in the 19th century, all the way up well into the 20th century, when there's any kind of hint of interracial romance or relationship. It can be hinted at and romanticized, but it can't be consummated, and everybody's got to die that participated in it, essentially. All right, well, this process, this success now of the Leatherstocking Tales has brought a cycle of its own in American literature and in American views of wilderness. So now, unlike in the 1600s, the American hero is not the one who comes and conquers the wilderness so he can subdue it and farm it. Rather, he revels in the wilderness. He revels in the forests. He loves being a part of it. Much like, again, this is a reflection of the Romantic era. This romantic trope of both loving nature and of loving solitude. Very Henry David Thoreau-like. But at the same time, Hawkeye is embodying the market revolution themes that we talked about a little bit, of the importance of individualism and being self-sufficient and being self-made, not relying on someone else. So individuality and this drive to keep moving westward ahead of the advance of civilization, because this glamorized Native American raised white guy is uncomfortable with civilization and more comfortable with wilderness. Now, despite the fact that there is so much romanticizing and glorifying of native culture, both the Indianized white guy and the romanticized Indian adopted brothers and friends that he has display a fundamental understanding of how native culture works, because there's nothing in there about the importance of balance or of considering how all things are related to one another like a spider web, like we discussed much earlier. That is the sort of thinking that would have been at the forefront if these were actual Native American characters. So this is also establishing a trend of writing about the Western frontier, writing about Native Americans and romanticizing them, but not really trying to understand how they think and how they feel, and not treating them as people with a future, but rather as people that are stuck in a disappearing and soon to be gone past, which is kind of how the frontier was being regarded and would be regarded throughout the rest of the century. All right, well, a lot of stuff there in that little 3-part discussion of the market revolution, stuff that still echoes well into the 21st century.